Well, I have not been a polar bear expert, but I've certainly been getting quite the education in polar bears. And it's been amazing to be able to teach others as I learn myself as I go through this. So let's go through some of my favorite facts and information that I've learned about polar bears during this time working at the zoo. So, well, there's a lot to it. And I guess I will say some books have been great companions. Here's one that's on my desk here, Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez, who also wrote Of Wolves and Men. He has some of the best ecological books to read that will teach you a lot of facts, but are not heavy in academic science terminology. They're really quite philosophical and metaphysical, the way that he writes. So this has been a great companion to turn to. So I mentioned a few things already. There are different subpopulations in which they live, and that the majority of polar bears actually live in Canada. Now, I was interested to learn that they're still quite rather abundant, and in most parts still living in their natural ranges. Now, this does make sense when you consider the fact that there is not a lot of human populations living in the Arctic and areas where polar bears live. And the people that do live in those areas have coexisted with polar bears for generations. Now, this sometimes gets messed up when we try to expand different Arctic regions, and mainly there's expansion in these areas due to industry. There hasn't been mass migrations into Arctic regions for empty real estate for people to live in. It's been people moving there for work. Now, there's military work that goes on in these regions. A lot of the work that's expanded is either mining or oil and gas. And so this heavy industry has caused some disruptions, but not nearly as much as in other areas. So I live in Alberta, and here in northern Alberta, there's been lots of massive disruption due to oil and gas industry. Like, there's been heavy industrial areas, big plants built, lots of waste from industry, mining, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, just big cities here, right? Calgary's 1.5 million people, Edmonton, north of us, about 1 million people. So these are areas where human populations have disrupted natural ecosystems, and especially all throughout the prairies. This is an area where the grasslands have been almost entirely turned into farmland, changed from their natural state. Thankfully, in the Arctic, a lot of those regions are still existing in their natural state, and that is true for much of the boreal forest as well. So these are really some of our last natural areas where humans have meddled with them the least. And so polar bears have benefited from this. There has been unregulated hunting over the last century, but that has changed, and in these areas, polar bear hunting is much more properly managed, such as hunting in other areas of Canada and the United States, for example. And a lot of traditional hunting practices still go on, which, through its very nature, if it's traditional, if it's gone on for a long period of time with the Inuit around polar bear populations, then it's sustainable by its very nature. If it wasn't sustainable, it wouldn't have been traditional, because people would have hunted a species and then they would have gone extinct, right? But if there has been hunting of a species like seals or polar bears for generations, then by its very nature, for it to have reached generations of humans doing this, it has to be sustainable. So there are still sustainable hunting practices with the people that coexist with polar bears and seals and other Arctic species. The population numbers, as it sits, are around 20 to 25,000 worldwide. If you think about any other large carnivore, grizzly bears have been eradicated from, again, the grassland regions. They don't live there anymore. They thankfully still exist in the Rocky Mountains and in other areas, but throughout a lot of North America, the brown bear has been eradicated. Black bears, too, to a lesser degree, they're still quite abundant. So other large predators have really dramatically declined with the expansion of human populations. Polar bears, not so much. So that has been encouraging to learn. However, you can imagine, if sea ice is no longer forming, Arctic temperatures increase dramatically over a short period of time, that number of 20 to 25,000 could dramatically decrease. So as it sits, they're still abundant, but incredibly vulnerable and at the whims of humanity, even if we're not in the Arctic in large populations and directly damaging them, directly hunting or eradicating them. Our global actions, so the billion to 2 billion people that live in India and China, for example, or the just hundreds of millions of us that live everywhere else in the world, what we do to the climate affects the Arctic. So many of us will never see polar bears in the wild, but our actions and the actions of our industries and our militaries and, the ways in which humans do massive pollution, that directly affects polar bears in the Arctic, as well as penguins in the south, species that we often won't have direct encounters with. That is all to say that we have a responsibility to protecting these Arctic and Antarctic species, for that matter, animals that are dependent on the cold that we could dramatically affect and alter. But anyways, it's encouraging to know how many of them there are still today, and how much sea ice still forms year after year. I think we learn about the effects of climate change, and we imagine that the Arctic is in much worse shape than it really is. I think there's still a lot of hope. When I flew back from Iceland, we flew over Greenland, and I was able to just watch that, and it was so incredible. You're flying and you see the ocean. This was the middle of September, the very end of the long summer period, and last summer, by most accounts, was the hottest summer ever on record. And this was mid-September at the end of the summer period, and you still see sea ice floating out there in the ocean, which is just insane to fathom. And then you fly over Greenland, and what do you see? You see some mountain ranges, which look kind of like the Rockies when you're flying over there. But then really quickly, the mountains are covered in ice. And then for about half an hour straight, and this is at the southern, short, skinny end of Greenland, and for about half an hour straight, we're just flying over a complete ice sheet. So just the massive glacier of Greenland. And I looked at that and felt so much hope that there is still all of these glaciers that exist in the north. And as much as we should learn about the melting Greenland ice cap and the melting of Antarctica, it's good to put in perspective and realize that there is still unfathomably large amounts of ice in the Arctic. Well, it still gets cold in the winter. I was tracking polar bears throughout this winter, which you can do at Polar Bears International, which is the organization who has provided us at the zoo a lot of our information that we share with visitors, a lot of the information that you'll see on the signs. And they also are who established the International Polar Bear Day. And you can track polar bears on their website. I think mainly in the western Hudson's Bay polar bear population, which is the polar bear population around Churchill, Manitoba, which is the most southern polar bear population in the world. And that's along Hudson's Bay in Manitoba. In Hudson's Bay is the Arctic Ocean, which juts down throughout this big bay that you can see whenever you look at a map of Canada. And that is the most southern population of polar bears. And right now, during the winter, when the sea ice is formed across Hudson's Bay, which is hard to fathom, this huge water bay completely being covered in sea ice. It's incredible. And, that space is about the size of the country of France. So literally during the winter, this entire landmass is formed. It's not land, of course, it's ice, but it's essentially an entire country formed where polar bears can then walk on and cross the entire expanse of Hudson's Bay. From there, again, they can hunt seals and all these sorts of things that they do during their prime time in the winter, which I should add, I say this often at the zoo, winter is prime time for polar bears. That is when they're most active and out and hunting seals, but it's not an easy life for them. It's a lot to hunt seals, and polar bears have tremendous patience, like insane patience and hunting skills and stealth abilities. They'll cover their black nose when they are approaching seals to try to not be seen, which is one spot that would be noticeable compared to their white fur, which isn't actually white, which I think is a silly fact to share with people. It's translucent. It's like snow. Snow is translucent, but it's white, right? To say that snow is not white is kind of lying, okay? So to say polar bear fur is not white, I feel like I'm gaslighting people. It is technically translucent, their fur. Then underneath they have black colored skin, and then polar bears have really thick blubber to keep them warm. And when they're hunting seals, they're mainly going for that blubber. And they can sometimes just eat the blubber and leave the rest of the seal behind. And that is where Arctic foxes might follow them and eat the leftover seal meat, or other bird species flying around will follow the polar bears and eat any leftover seal meat. So those are some interesting dynamics about polar bears and some of the many, many things that you learn. And what I love is you learn about an animal, and it's not just learning their biology, it's learning their ecology. And by learning the ecology of a species, you're just learning about general ecology, you're learning about ecosystems. And from one species, you learn about another. And from that species, you learn about another. And what I found interesting is thinking about marine mammals that live in the Arctic and how the sea ice affects them as well. So where the narwhals or the bowhead whales live, that is dependent on where the sea ice is formed. If sea ice has formed in large swaths, right, these marine mammals need to breathe air. So if it's a huge space of sea ice, they can't make it to the other side, to the open water. And so the sea ice also dictates the ocean life underneath. Sea ice forms because of the fresh water that goes into the ocean. Right? It's not the salt water freezing, it's the fresh water that's coming from all the rivers from the continent. And that goes and mixes with the salt water and freezes into thick sea ice. The ice in the Arctic is much thicker than the ice in Antarctica. So that's interesting too. Not all sea ice is created equal. And the Antarctica sea ice is formed differently than the Arctic sea ice. And underneath it, because of its fresh water, melting off of it will be sediment of dirt and other organic life from the continent. And that'll go into the ocean, and that creates food for phytoplankton. And then that creates food for small fish. And then this whole ecosystem that is dependent on the sea ice. So it's not just, if the sea ice melts, polar bears won't be able to walk across Hudson's Bay. It's like if the sea ice doesn't form, that destroys the lifeblood for the entire chain of life. So that's what's at risk with the loss of sea ice, is not just these simplistic things, but the complexities of the entire ecosystem, which I always try to impress upon myself, is that if you think you know a little bit about the ecology of a landscape, you're just at the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. And as we know, the tip of the iceberg visible to us, underneath, that's the majority of the ice is underwater. It's just a small, 40% or 1/3 of the iceberg that you actually see floating across the water. Well, it's very fascinating things, and maybe we can stop the video there. Otherwise, I could continue to ramble on about polar bears and all the other dynamics of Arctic life, which I very much enjoyed to learn about. From this point forward, I'm going to continue to talk to people and tell stories about polar bears at the zoo and continue to learn from others, right? The most I learn is when someone, could be a little kid with an interesting question or an adult thinking through something deeply, and they'll ask me a question that I've never considered before. And that's what spurs me on to research more and to ask others and to learn the things that I don't know. And then when I learn something, I relearn it by going out and sharing it with people. And it's an incredible atmosphere at zoos to learn about ecology and to understand human ecology as well, and about how we fit into the wider world with all the biodiversity that exists around us, as well as I would love opportunities to go to Churchill. There's different scientific organizations that work there and around there studying polar bears, and I think that would be fantastic to get involved in whatever way I could. Going back to Iceland, and I would love to go to Greenland as well. And here's just maybe a side note that we can end on in terms of human ecology. I would love to visit northern Russia and understand the Arctic of Russia as well. And something that I think is horrible and gets in the way of our conservation of nature is human conflicts, right? And I love examples where the conservation of nature and the study and the scientific intrigue of nature can bypass human conflicts. And so, you still have today organizations like the World Wildlife Foundation with scientists in Russia working with scientists in North America, for example. And so the more that we can solve our differences within humanity and realize that we're all human and share the same planet. And the less we can have conflicts and wars and all of these horrible things that are bad for humans, of course, but also bad for the environment and all of the other species involved, that's how we'll be able to make good progress. So if I think about, what is it that we can do to help vulnerable species like polar bears and Arctic ecosystems, yes, of course, cutting back on fossil fuels and doing all of these different things to make our economy more green. But I think the number one thing is just to end war and end human conflicts. Of course, to end human suffering for our sake and for empathy and love for our own species, but to end war and human conflicts for the sake of biodiversity as well. And that is a message that I don't give often when I'm at the zoo because, I don't want to talk about bad things such as war and suffering and human conflicts. I mean, we think about that enough as it is, but that is a message that I'm going to continue to say as much as I can in my writings and in my personal work and in videos and podcasts like this as well. So that is the number one thing that I think about that we need to do collectively as a society to help with conservation of nature and to help with whatever species you care about is to first and foremost end human suffering within war and conflicts of this nature, and just to band together and work as one, as the human species that we are, and as the impact that we have for the entire world, for every species and every ecosystem. So that's something to think about. I hope you learned something about polar bears, and happy International Polar Bear Day, February 27th, 2024. So goodbye, peace to the world. -20 would be like pretty chilly day there, even in the north of Iceland.